Welcome to the U.S. Daily Brief channel. Although the Russian army is the second largest army in the world, it is losing its superiority in the war with Ukraine and is losing heavy ammunition and weapons on many fronts. However, this is an issue that the Russian army takes the risk of and is far from being the main problem. The main problem is that the soldiers of the Russian army can leave the war at any time, and the morale and weariness caused by the failure and excessively harsh administration in the army. Russia's senseless war, which drew the reaction of the whole world, has been going on for almost 4 months, and thanks to the strong resistance of Ukraine, Russia could not make any progress in the war in Ukraine. Even now, Russia has begun to lose the areas it occupied. In addition to the psychological weight of the heavy defeat in the region, the soldiers of the Russian forces are also very disturbed by Moscow's attitude towards them. Some Russian elite special forces left their areas, while others began to refuse to go to the front in Ukraine. In fact, according to the audio recordings obtained by the Ukrainian intelligence, it is stated that some Russian soldiers came to a psychological point ready to kill the generals who led the attacks. Last week, Russian National Guard Rogvardia elite soldiers were formally dismissed after they rejected their duties to participate in Russian President Vladimir Putin's internationally condemned military action against Ukraine. This elite military unit was seen as a unit that was expected to be of great use in Ukraine and would lead Russian operations. At the same time, Rogvardia was described as Putin's special unit. However, this unit refused to participate in the war in Ukraine and was therefore punished and dismissed by Putin. The soldiers objected to the decision, which included the dismissal of 115 elite Russian soldiers. However, the Russian courts found this decision justified and stated that the soldiers should fight at the front when their state needed it. The situation in the Russian army at the moment is so deplorable that Russian commanders prefer to protect equipment rather than save the lives of wounded Russian troops on the battlefield. It is also stated that material and artillery support was not provided to the troops that went too far. The Ukrainian Military Intelligence Directorate reported that Russian commanders are trying to protect military equipment by forbidding drivers to evacuate wounded soldiers or to supply supplies to troops that have gone too far. Refusing to risk equipment to evacuate wounded personnel on the battlefield and not allowing the evacuation of the wounded can undoubtedly be considered a flagrant violation of military professionalism. Considering Russia's harsh stance and the dismayed state of the soldiers from this war, Putin's dream became more impossible with each passing day and started to turn into a nightmare for Putin. After all, Russia may even lose Crimea along with Donetsk and Luhansk at the end of this war. For the sake of Putin's ambitions, many civilians were harmed and civilian infrastructures were destroyed in Ukraine, which was taken by the Russian army for the invasion attempt on February 24. There was no logical or valid reason for this. At the same time, over 30,000 soldiers from both Ukraine and Russia lost their lives. Russian military personnel losses, which are now over 33,000, continue to increase. For this reason, the fact that Russian troops did not participate in the Ukrainian war does not seem like a questionable situation. According to the court, the arbitrary refusal of soldiers to fulfill an official duty corresponds to such an important issue as to deprive them of their military service. Also, while the Russians appear to largely support Putin's actions targeting his Eastern European neighbors, there have been signs of discontent and opposition since the start of the full-scale invasion in February. In the early days of the war, thousands of anti-war protesters across the country were arrested by the Russian authorities. Some lawmakers and members of the Russian elite also openly opposed the attack on Ukraine. As a result of these protests, Russia's heavy sanctions against the opposition came to light. A certain section of the Russian population, unwilling to participate in Putin's unjust war, rejected the war. Leonid Vysyukovich, a member of the Communist Party faction, reported that he called on Putin to stop the months-long war. The call also included the withdrawal of Russian troops from Eastern Europe. Drawing attention to the young people who die every day, Vysyukovich stated that as a result of stopping Putin, the number of orphans in the country will increase and they do not want this. At the same time, we need to look deeply at the cracks in the Russian army, which we briefly touched upon at the beginning. The Ukrainian armed forces said in a statement that Russian soldiers were ready to kill the generals who led the attacks. The statement claims that the Russian forces almost killed General Valery Solodchuk and his bodyguards, who came to the Donetsk region to encourage the troops at the front. So how can such an event take place within the world's second-largest army? The soldiers refused to obey the order and were ready to blow up the high guests. That's why the Russian general fled from the front in embarrassment, wagging his tail, it said. It was stated that this was evidenced by a phone call received by the Ukrainian security service of a Russian soldier named Zagarbnikov and his wife. As a summary of the conversation, the Russian general, who came for encouragement, was forcing the Russian soldiers to attack Donbass. However, only 215 soldiers remained from the 600-strong BTG. This could only be a suicide mission. All the soldiers in BTG refused to fight and were willing to be killed there. Russian soldiers in BTG were threatened with guns to attack, and even Russian Spetsnaz pointed guns at them. Russian soldier Zagarbnikov's last sentence in the conversation with his wife was, "That's all." Even Spetsnaz, Russian special forces, pointed guns at us, and we pointed guns at them. In short, we almost shot each other. Then he got in his car and drove off. Said. It is also known that Russian military units have been fighting in the region for a long time due to insufficient equipment and feeding conditions. In fact, a soldier who has been in the region since the first days of the war, who later returned to his country, states that the Russian army's lack of equipment is unbelievable when they go to the region. The soldier states that they are not even provided with night vision and that this is not a very costly expense for Russia. Russian soldiers stated that they saw the Russian army as the largest army in the world before the war, but now they say that they understand that this thought is very wrong. One of the soldiers who was in Russia for compulsory military service states that he signed a professional contract and joined the Russian army for 2 years. He emphasizes that they were taken to the region to carry out exercises around Ukraine before February 24, and then they hastily crossed the Ukrainian border and started the attack. However, after crossing the Ukrainian border and facing intense Ukrainian attacks and bombardments, he states that even that day he understood that the Russian army would lose. He says they are constantly bombarded, both on the go and when parked at night. In his 50-man unit, 10 people were killed and 10 injured. Almost all of his comrades were under the age of 25. Soldiers say most of the casualties were due to Russia's haste. He reports that they advanced without any protection behind them and did not even conduct minesweepers. He says that if these had been accomplished, we would have lost far fewer soldiers. Realizing that they were only used as bait in the region where they were exiled as recruits, the soldier later returned to Russia. Lawsuits were brought against him, but they were not continued. If you notice, the general psychology of the Russian soldiers seems to be summarized over a single soldier. Most of the Russian soldiers thought they would only conduct one exercise around Ukraine before February 24, and many of them found themselves in the war without even saying goodbye to their families. There have been comments that Putin is walking a youth to death for the sake of his own ambitions, and not reverting from this mistake will cause many more Russian young people to be in that war unintentionally, maybe even killed, maybe even die. Regardless, both Ukrainian and Russian soldiers are victims of Putin, and when we look at the centuries-long history of World War, there is never a winner. However, there is much to be lost. We hope that first of all, Ukrainian and Russian families and soldiers will find peace, and Ukraine will preserve the territorial integrity